Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Uganda moved quickly to bring in one of the toughest African coronavirus lockdowns. That's been extended for another 2 weeks, even as some restrictions are lifted, allowing limited reopening of businesses. Also, moves to bring in criminal penalties for female genital mutilation in Sudan are welcomed by activists, hoping that the changes being brought in will show more of a step forward for women's rights since the fall of Omar al-Bashir last year. And Cameroonian private papers still their presses for a day in protest over the pressures of coronavirus restrictions. They're demanding more support from the government. We hear from our correspondents in the country. But first, Kampala was livelier than it's been for 5 weeks on Tuesday, as coronavirus precautions were eased somewhat and some businesses allowed to reopen. Uganda was quick to bring in some of the toughest restrictions on the continent in response to the pandemic. The country's logged just 97 official COVID-19 cases and no deaths. Although there is now some let-up to the safety provisions, the lockdown has been extended for another 2 weeks. Grania Harrington brings us more from Kampala.
Uganda has one of the strictest lockdowns in the region. So schools and universities have all been shut. All businesses considered not to be essential have been closed down. All public gatherings, including big religious services, have been shut down. The border has been shut, except for cargo. And up until now, both public and private transport has been banned. So there has been some loosening of those restrictions. As you can see, there are certainly a lot more private vehicles on the road today. Now, technically, they're all supposed to have a government permit in order to be able to move, but that particular restriction seems to be applied a little bit less strictly today. So while some people are back to work, a lot of people have said to me today that they're still going to struggle to make ends meet, and then this new 2-week extension was bad news for them. It's estimated that around 80% of Ugandans work in the informal sector. So that means there are thousands of motorcycle taxi drivers, market vendors, street vendors, domestic workers who are really struggling to make ends meet under this lockdown. And so while there seems to be a very good understanding of why these restrictions are in place, there are lots of people who say that this 2-week extension is going to hurt them very, very hard.
Grania Harrington there for us. Now, Somalia has promised to investigate the crash of a Kenyan plane that went down, killing 6 people on board. It had left Mogadishu carrying medical supplies and crashed as it approached ABDEL airstrip, which is a base for the Ethiopian military under the African Union mission, which is combating Somali al-Shabaab extremists. Kenya has raised questions about what happened. One Somali official has reportedly claimed that the aircraft was shot down. And trials to test the effectiveness of the BCG vaccine in protecting against coronavirus have started in South Africa, with 7,220 cases and 138 deaths. It's the country most affected by COVID-19 on the continent. 250 health workers in Cape Town have been given booster shots that have long been used as immunisation against tuberculosis. 250 others have been given placebos. Researchers say that children immunised with BCG tend to suffer less from respiratory illnesses. The plan is to ramp up the studies to 3,000 healthcare workers in the city. Similar trials are also being carried out in Australia and Europe.
Our study was essentially based on the study that's being done in the Netherlands. It's called BCG Corona Elderly, and they're looking at similar outcomes to us. So we actually had a look at their protocol and decided that this was actually a fantastic idea, and we wanted to do similar research ourselves.
Activists in Sudan are hoping that recent moves to criminalise female genital mutilation will kickstart a new era for women's rights in the country. Under the newly approved amendments, anyone who carries out the operation could face up to 3 years in prison. The vast majority of women in the country have undergone FGM, and despite efforts to change the law, there are concerns it will take more to change minds about the practice in conservative communities. Nicolas Chemin has more.
Women's rights activists heard the news when they were at home during the lockdown that has been imposed in Khartoum. Abdullah Hamdok's government has criminalised female genital mutilation, making it punishable by 3 years in jail. According to UN data, almost 9 out of 10 women and girls in Sudan have undergone FGM. In Khartoum's deserted streets, women welcomed the government's decision.
نحن كلنا بقينا يعني من ضمن ضحايا الختان لأنه زمان بعض النساء بيموتن في الولادة نتيجة الختان وفي البعض الآخر يعني حتى في الزواج.
Activist Manal ABDEL HALIM says this announcement is only the first step because many people believe this traditional practice is necessary to marry their daughters.
كثير من الناس بيعتقدوا إنه والله مسألة القانون لا تحل الإشكال ومسألة القانون لابد يعني القانون وحده لا يكفي. أكيد القانون وحده لا يكفي معه التوعية معه برامج شغالة كثيرة جدا.
Women's issues are now more important in Sudan thanks to the role women played in the 9-month-long street protest that led to the fall of Omar al-Bashir. He was toppled last year after 3 decades in power. The new Prime Minister, Abdullah Hamdok, has appointed women to cabinet positions. And he has repealed the old regime's Public Order Act that restricted women's freedom of movement, dress and work.
And thousands of people in Nairobi have had their homes destroyed by bulldozers this week. Armed police looked on as the corrugated iron houses were flattened in the Kariobangi area. Distraught residents say that they had no notice of the demolition and that there had been a court order to stop the destruction. And Cameroonian press have found it hard going under coronavirus measures in the country and say that without more support from the government, they're at risk of being silenced. This week, several papers didn't go to print in protest. Our correspondents report.
Some newsstands are half empty in the heart of Yaoundé. Over 50 privately owned newspapers have decided not to publish. A huge disappointment for this reader who usually gets daily information from the private press.
Je suis venu regarder si effectivement leur décision était vraie ou faux. On regrette. Jusque si on ne lit pas les presses, on va lire quoi? Est-ce qu'on va regarder le journal tous les jours puisque le journal dit le contraire de ce que la presse dit?
A few kilometers away, we are at the head office of MUTATIONS, the main daily newspaper in the country. It's an almost empty newsroom.
Vous pouvez constater que c'est une rédaction où il y a toujours beaucoup de vie. Mais aujourd'hui, manifestement, c'est comme une ambiance de deuil.
The head of the publication is worried. The ongoing financial strain linked to coronavirus crisis has meant he has not been able to pay the salaries of a dozen of his journalists for a couple of months.
Il y a eu des mouvements, des tentatives embryonnaires qui n'ont pas porté pour créer notre ras-le-bol vis-à-vis du gouvernement. Mais le coronavirus nous a tellement confinés, nous, entreprises de presse, tel qu'on ne pouvait plus rester indifférents. Là, il s'agit d'une question de suivi.
The newspaper corporation has decided to launch a media campaign. This morning, Thierry Ndong is guest on this popular radio show. He represents private newspaper publishers, and they want some help from the state, the main buyer of advertisement slots.
Nous sommes dans le jonglage au quotidien et chaque édition de journal en kiosque est un miracle. Ça ne va pas et si rien n'est fait, il est possible que du jour au lendemain, toutes les entreprises de presse ferment au Cameroun.
The call for state support remains unanswered for now, but the bosses of the private press are not giving up. If nothing is done, they are preparing for more dead press days in the coming weeks.
Well, thanks very much for joining us on Eye on Africa. For more news from around the world and on the continent, do check out our website, www.france24.com. Otherwise, do stay tuned. More news and updates coming up after this short break. Take care.